who produces, distributes, supplies, or markets any coin, stamp, official map, and so on, as we can see in the law, which in any manner misrepresents or conveys misleading information to the public about the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory, which adds, in fact, to the denialism strategy of the administrative power. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is, in fact, necessary to introduce such a punitive system on this type of denialism and ensure the cessation of all actions intentionally or recklessly which promotes it. The revised version of the bill, Mr. Speaker, sir, has in fact been narrowed to ensure it is primarily and foremost directed against the administrative power, which is the UK, and towards conduct that would intentionally or otherwise mislead or misinform public opinion and cause harm or be prejudicial to the sovereignty of our republic. And as the Prime Minister took the pain to underline, Mr. Speaker, sir, of high import is the fact that this bill has no incidence whatsoever on our rights and freedom, on the traditional rights and freedom, which, as we know, are a prized element of our democracy. Sovereignty, Mr. Speaker, goes to the heart of what it means to be independent. Sovereignty is indivisible and neither can be traded or negotiated. And precisely, Mr. Speaker, so the main object of this bill is therefore to make powers available for dealing with certain activities directed against the integrity and sovereignty of Mauritius over the Chagos Archipelago. This bill, when passed, Mr. Speaker, sir, will safeguard the sovereignty and the integrity of Mauritius and ensure that no prejudice is caused to its sovereignty. This bill will ensure the initiation of criminal proceedings against persons or entities acting on behalf of a foreign country or entity which issues stamps or coins or other objects on behalf of the so-called BIUT, and map publishers which purport to misrepresent the Chagos Archipelago as a British territory. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is my considered view also that this bill passes the test of necessity and proportionality. I fully support this bill, and I hope that this House will, by general consent, see that it is passed as we agree with the opposition unanimously. Before I conclude, Mr. Speaker, sir, it is my duty to thank all those who have advanced the cause of the Chagos Archipelago and who have been by the side of the Chagosians, Mr. Speaker, sir. Many of them are no longer here, Mr. Speaker, sir. The Michel brothers, the previous speaker himself, and many others, Mr. Bancoul, and all these old ladies, Chagosian ladies, Mr. Speaker, sir, whom we still remember, although they are no longer with us. But I would like to specifically acknowledge the leadership of the Honourable Prime Minister in his relentless pursuit against odds of this vital question until real progress is achieved. Unfortunately, we can't say has been achieved because there's still some way to go, Mr. Speaker, sir. And the Honourable Prime Minister, as we all know, follows in the footsteps of his beloved father, the former Prime Minister, Sir Anirudh Jagannath, whose decades-long stewardship in advancing our Chagos Archipelago struggle has been instrumental in reaching where we are today, and whom history will remember and revere as the father of the complete decolonization of Mauritius. I have done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.
Mr. the Speaker, sir, let me right from the very outset state in very clear terms, Mr. the Speaker, sir, that we, the Labour Party, we are going to vote for the amendment. I think there is consensus in the House that this is a legitimate move that would render illegal and unlawful any act that would, in one way or the other, undermine the sovereignty of our territory as defined under the Constitution. Just for the purposes of the record, Mr. the Speaker, sir, we know that in 1992, our Constitution was amended to make it clear that Tromelin Island and the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego Garcia, forms part of our territory, and therefore it is only legitimate to hold that any official document or object, be it stamp, coins, or map, that misrepresents our territory is not within the spirit of our Constitution, and therefore ought to be declared illegal. The Honorable Prime Minister has extensively elaborated on the circumstances which has led to the proposed amendment. He talked about the UK persistently producing stamps and coins, undermining our sovereignty on Chagos, and I therefore fully endorse the purport of the amendments that is being brought by the Honorable Prime Minister. Honorable Paul Béranger, who is very well versed on the dossier of Chagos, has also made certain pertinent questions which I believe requires serious consideration by government as well. However, Mr. the Speaker, sir, we also have to bear in mind that our Constitution also guarantees the freedom of expression, and I see avec raison that this bill, which was introduced on two previous occasions, on the 10th of July 2020 and the 24th of August 2020, had to be withdrawn, readjusted, amended, so that the section that we are today introducing does not infringe someone's freedoms of expression. However, I see that the definition of a foreign state has been restricted to a state which has been the subject of a determination by an international court or tribunal, holding that it has no valid claim to sovereignty over any part of the territory of Mauritius. The only two foreign countries, as far as I can remember, against whom we have had disputes about sovereignty and where determinations have been made by international tribunals, are the United Kingdom and recently the Maldives. For the UK, we have had the UN Arbitral Tribunal ruling on the 18th of March 2015, which is binding and which the UK has recognized, declaring the marine protected area incompatible with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. In fact, history will recall, and it is important that we place on record, that this ruling was in fact the turning point in our claim to sovereignty over Chagos. This was the first time that an international tribunal where two dissenting judges ruled that the excision of the Chagos from the territory of Mauritius was unlawful. This was the first time in our long fight over sovereignty of Chagos that we felt some hope. And I heard the Honorable Vice Prime Minister, who intervened just before me, expressing his gratitude to everyone, but he forgot, unfortunately, to recognize here the contribution of the then Prime Minister, Dr. the Honorable Navin Amgulam, who was the one behind this case that we brought before the UN Arbitral Tribunal. With the arbitral ruling, the then Prime Minister laid the stepping stone in our struggle for Chagos. The proceedings and records produced before the tribunal bears testimony, Mr. the Speaker, sir, of the circumstances in which the Mauritian leaders at that time were arm-twisted into the deal to detach Chagos for the independence of Mauritius. Then we had the advisory opinion of the ICJ, issued on the 25th of February 2019, stating in no uncertain terms that the occupation of the Chagos archipelago by the UK was unlawful. And here we have to place on record the determination and passion of late Saniro Jagnat for his participation and contribution in the proceedings and deliberations before the ICJ. So these were, Mr. the Speaker, sir, the two instances where, so far as the UK is concerned, tribunals of the UN have recognized our legitimate and unquestionable claim for sovereignty on the Chagos archipelago. As far as the Maldives is concerned, we have had the ruling of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, setting aside the preliminary objection raised by the Maldives that the UK was an interested third party, and the tribunal went on to reaffirm the sovereignty of Mauritius over the Chagos archipelago in line, with the ruling of in line with the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. There have been, I think the Honorable Prime Minister mentioned it, there have been further important and recent developments as well that would justify, in my opinion, the amendments that are being brought to our law. Firstly, in February 2020, the UN cartographic designation, the new map of the world, which recognizes the Chagos archipelago as forming part of the Mauritian territory. I remember, in fact, the Honorable Prime Minister announced this on the national TV en plein confinement. The decision of the UN cartographic. And secondly, more recently, in August 2021, we have had the specialized UN agency, the Universal Postal Union, formally acknowledging that the Chagos archipelago is an integral part of the territory of Mauritius, and that will no longer register, distribute, or forward postage stamps issued by the BIOT. Therefore, as far as the UN is concerned, Mr. the Speaker, sir, mails from the Chagos archipelago can only bear the stamps of Mauritius. My only qualms, Mr. the Speaker, sir, is that, with regards to this amendment, is that we have restricted the definition of foreign state to those countries where there has been an award against them, but we also have to think about the issue concerning Tromlin. The co-management agreement of the island is yet to be ratified by the French National Assembly, and therefore, as far as Tromlin is concerned, we still have some unfinished business. To finish, I will also stress on one last point before I conclude. Today it is commendable that government has decided to come before the Legislative Assembly to seek approval to criminalize an action by a foreign state that seeks to undermine our sovereignty. And rightly so, because when it comes to sovereignty and territory, this is an issue of national interest. In the same spirit, I think it is also advisable that in a democracy like Mauritius, government should also seek the approval of the Legislative Assembly when it makes any kind of dealing with any foreign country, be it a friendly country, with regards to any part of our territory. Any dealing on our territory, any dealing with regards to our territory, and obviously I'm here referring to Agalega, behind the back of our people, is an act which is as much reprehensible as misrepresenting our sovereignty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.
Honourable Kondrushan.
Mr. Speaker, sir, allow me to thank you for granting me the opportunity to bring my contributions to the debates on the Criminal Code Amendment Bill. Mr. Speaker, sir, the first paragraph of our Constitution states that, and I quote, "Mauritius shall be a sovereign democratic state which shall be known as the Republic of Mauritius," end of quote. The significance of this sentence is that we have achieved our independence and we take decisions for our country in a democratic manner. This is how we are recognized throughout the world as the Republic of Mauritius, Mauritius being the main island, and according to our constitutions, Mauritius includes Rodrigue, Agalega, Tromlin, Cargados, Carajos, and the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego Garcia. Mr. Speaker, sir, everybody would remember having seen a set of very pretty postal stamps depicting sea slugs and angelfish, and indeed it did look very nice, but what some might not have paid attention to was the literature on the stamps and its implications. Similarly, there could be a chance that this Criminal Code Amendment Bill 2021 is being brought to the Assembly today for debates. Some might just see a 3-page bill with an insert of only one new section, that is Section 76B. This piece of legislation, especially the amendment being brought, goes far beyond and deeper than a 3-page bill. Mr. Speaker, sir, the House will recall that the Universal Postal Union, referred to as the UPU, which is the United Nations agency in charge of the world's postal policies, voted to block the use of UK stamps from the Chagos Archipelago in August this year, implying thereby that all posts from the Chagos Islands must now bear stamps of the Republic of Mauritius and not those of the so-called British Indian Ocean Territory. Following this ruling by UPU, BBC's correspondent for Africa, Mr. Andrew Harding, said that, and I quote, "The near unanimous vote by the UPU to make those stamps illegal worldwide is a blow to Britain and another sign of its growing isolation over its claims to the Chagos Island," end of quote. This ruling, Mr. Speaker, sir, by the UPU that Mauritian stamps and postcodes will now henceforth be used for postal dealings of the Chagos Archipelago is yet another landmark ruling. And commenting on the latter to the international press, our Honourable Prime Minister stated that, and I quote again, This is another big step in favor of the recognition of the sovereignty of Mauritius over the Chagos. End of quote. The matter at hand was and is about recognition of the sovereignty of Mauritius. Very few would have observed this, Mr. Speaker, sir, and I am allowing myself to strongly stress upon this point in case the enormity of this ruling would have escaped the attention of some. Sovereignty, Mr. Speaker, sir, in essence, under international law, is a power and right to govern, recognized or effectively asserted in respect of a defined part of the globe. A fundamental principle of international law is that a state can generally control activities within the territory over which it has sovereignty. The Criminal Code Amendment Bill 2021 refers to, and I quote, misrepresenting the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, sir, in my very humble opinion as a fairly new parliamentarian, I have to admit that I feel rather disappointed by the very timid participation from the other side of the House to what can only be termed as one of the historical outcomes of our arduous fight for the sovereignty as a nation. Mr. Speaker, sir, one of the main objectives of this bill is to criminalize any act that misrepresents or provides misleading information about the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory. And to appreciate the significance of this bill, we should understand the circumstances in which this bill has been brought to the House by the Honourable Prime Minister today. We should recall the circumstances in which we achieved independence and the fights of successive governments as far as our territories are concerned. Mr. Speaker, sir, this government does not recognize the British Indian Ocean Territory created in 1965 to excise the Chagos archipelago from the territory of Mauritius. Thousands of inhabitants were shamefully, forcefully uprooted from their homeland. Despite the promise that they would be allowed to return, they have repeatedly been barred through many subterfuges from returning to their homeland, which in effect amounts to a basic human right violation. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Chagos archipelago forms an integral part of the territory of Mauritius under both the Mauritian law and the international law. This Criminal Code Amendment Bill is therefore another logical, it's a natural step in the fight of an entire nation in ascertaining the right of our beloved republic over its territories. And Mr. Speaker, sir, while we are on the topic of patriotism, I believe it is most befitting at this juncture to pay tribute to late Sir Nehru Jagnat, Queen's Counsel, who, as the only surviving participant of the 1965 negotiations in London, donned his lawyer's gown in February 2019 and opened the oral hearings before the International Court of Justice in Hague. Late Sir Nehru Jagnat unambiguously demonstrated at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, how Mauritian representatives were threatened not to be granted independence should they not agree to the dismemberment of Mauritius. I quote, it was real blackmail. And he also quoted that what Mr. Harold Wilson told the Mauritians, if you do not agree to what I'm proposing about the Chagos Islands, then forget about independence. Mr. Speaker, sir, late Sir Nehru Jagnat, in a style unique to himself, captured the essence of this human tragedy, and the top court at the United Nations ruled that the archipelago is legally a part of Mauritius, and also advised Britain to hand over the islands, and I quote, as rapidly as possible. This advisory opinion has been a tremendous victory against this injustice. The fight for sovereignty over our territories requires a perpetual, a sustained, a relentless engagement of our political leaders, irrespective of party politics. And Mr. Speaker, sir, giving credit where it's due, the House will recall that it was the then former Prime Minister, Navin Chandra Ramgoolam, in 2010, who initiated a case against the UK before the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Mr. Speaker, sir, Honourable Béranger earlier started his intervention by saying that he will be encouraging a unanimous vote for this piece of legislation, and also stated that his party was the first political party that set the ball rolling as far as discussions on sovereignty of Chagos is concerned. Mr. Speaker, sir, logic and perhaps etiquette would demand that the Honourable Member, Paul Béranger, at least congratulated the Prime Minister for bringing this historical piece of legislation today. And I would like to reassure the Honourable Member Béranger that this government, with the support of an entire nation, will carry on forward on this journey while ensuring that our diplomatic relations are preserved. In fact, the government has been congratulated by international instances for the courteous and diligent manner with which we have handled this delicate matter so far, and we shall carry on our fight very respectfully. Mr. Speaker, sir, our journey to complete sovereignty over our territories has been, in fact, even more so now, it has been riddled with adversity, sometimes with very thinly veiled threats. We all need to be warriors when it comes to our claim of sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago, and that is why we have to salute, we have to commend the determination of our Prime Minister as the leader of the government, but also as the leader of the MSM party to carry forward the legacy left by late Sir Anirudh Jagannath in his quest for complete decolonization and sovereignty over our territories and restoration of the rights of the Chagosian people. Mr. Speaker, sir, I will conclude by saying that this bill is one of the many testimonies of our Prime Minister's unflinching, his relentless commitment to fight for a just cause that goes beyond party politics. It is all about patriotism and love for our motherland. Over the past decade, we had recourse to all international instances in our fight for the truth and righteousness. Mr. Speaker, sir, we have, during our intervention and speeches, we have this habit, this good habit, I should say, of quoting famous figures in this assembly. But with your permission, Mr. Speaker, sir, I would like to end with a statement by none other than our Prime Minister, and I quote, "Je suis déterminé, malgré l'adversité, je continue à voir comment organiser une visite sur l'archipel. Aussi longtemps que je vivrai, nous regagnerons le territoire." End of quote. Allow me to put on record, Mr. Speaker, sir, my admiration and my pride to our Prime Minister for bringing this historical piece of legislation to the House. Long live the Republic of Mauritius, and I thank you for your attention.
Ron Chan.
COVID-19, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is with immense honor and gratitude that I am addressing this August Assembly on this very important piece of legislation. The bill presented will certainly mark a major step towards consolidating our lawful claim around our territorial sovereignty, and I will endeavor to contribute constructively to today's debates. From the very outset, let me commend the Honourable Prime Minister for presenting this bill, which will aim to further protect our nation's sovereignty. Mr. Speaker, sir, until 1810, Mauritius was a French colony called Île-de-France. When the island was ceded to the British, the commander of the French forces quite generously agreed to introduce Article 8 in the Act of Capitulation, which stated les habitants de l'Île-de-France pourront conserver leurs lois, coutumes et religion. Most of those laws dealt with criminal law and procedure. The majority laws that were enacted in Mauritius between 1810 and 1840 were set out in two columns, one in French and one in English, and the most noteworthy being the Penal Code Ordinance of 1838, which is now our Criminal Code. In 1968, when Mauritius gained independence, it was endowed with a written constitution, which is the supreme law. The existing laws order in council was to the effect that the existing laws would continue to remain in force unless inconsistent with the Constitution. After independence, the Penal Code has been reenacted as the Criminal Code. The Criminal Code has undergone a number of amendments, but the changes in the criminal law have been made by special laws, such as the Dangerous Drugs Act. Quite often, the changes effected in the criminal law have been influenced by standard setting at the international level. Over the years, the Criminal Code has been subjected to a number of amendments with a view to keep up with development in the maintenance of law and order. The law is a dynamic discipline and not static, so it needs to be amended to reflect contemporary challenges. But unfortunately, some of the members of this House seem to be static and old-fashioned, and some are even criticizing the changes that have been proposed in this bill as an attempt to have freedom of expression. Mr. Speaker, sir, today we are facing testing times, and there is a historical cry for the law to be revisited in order to protect our territorial sovereignty. The decision of the International Court of Justice on the Chagos Island has in fact completed our independence and reinstated our sovereignty over the territories which were previously occupied by the British under the cloak of what they term as the British Indian Ocean Territories, the BIUT, which quite rightly Mauritius never agreed to. It has been noted with concern that recently some enemies, I would say, some enemies of the state have tried to distort the truth about our territorial sovereignty, and some have taken the liberty to insult our statehood. Others are trying to print documents to mislead the world about our geographical characteristics. For 50 years, the United Kingdom has sheltered itself in a series of parliamentary debates, internal discussions, bilateral meetings, and English Supreme Court or High Court judgments, with the ultimate view to delay the truth coming out. However, in 2019, following a long fight undertaken by the government under the Prime Ministership of Honorable Pravin Kumar Jagannath, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion and the UN General Assembly resolution have ended this long-standing litigation by advising that the UK claim to sovereignty was not valid and that Chagosian would have to be granted the right to abode and settlement, hence ending the process of decolonization of Mauritius, which started in 1968. Mr. Speaker, sir, following long periods of Dutch and French occupation from 1638 to 1810, there followed 157 years of British colonial rule. Throughout that period, the Chagos archipelago was always an integral part of Mauritius and was treated as such by successive administering powers. Let me reiterate, Mr. Speaker, sir, the aim is sole and specific, namely to protect the sovereignty of our republic from any misinformation. They have been shouting loud that there is a hidden agenda, or coming up with frivolous conspiracy theories as being aired by certain from the opposition side. Mr. Speaker, sir, one argument that the opposition keep using by airing on platforms they can be it on social media platforms, newspapers, radios, or even international news, is that through our government's actions, their freedom of expression is under attack. Indeed, it has been their favorite argument for many years now, and for some more experienced opposition members for many decades now. Many governments in our countries, in other countries, have found it difficult to deny that they have been, in fact, suppressing the freedom of expression of their people and press to the point that not even a single person would dare to express an opinion. However, what we observe here in Mauritius is that for years and sometimes decades, some members have been voicing out their opinions even more vehemently through the even more varied communication platforms. The honest fact, Mr. Speaker, sir, is that they have an almost daily and sometimes hourly presence on certain radios, newspaper, or even social medias. In fact, the opposition have only been using the argument of freedom of expression as a rhetorical argument without any substance. The very fact that they are allowed outside this assembly and on so many platforms without any disturbances or issues is the proof that their freedom of expression is in fact increasing. What this government has done, unlike a certain former prime minister, well, this is to curtail the press freedom to the extent of arresting journalists in 2009, 2010, and 2012, and of same private radios, and some private radios, of course, and newspapers on which they are now enjoying plenty of coverage. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, sir, what I also find appalling is that the opposition, some opposition members keep referring to the fundamental rights of freedom of individual. Indeed, the freedom of expression is enshrined in the constitutions and gives, and I quote, freedom of conscience, of expression, of assembly and association, and freedom to establish schools. Perhaps some members can stop reading selectively, or maybe to ensure that they actually read and understand that the paragraph of Chapter 2, Section 3 of the Constitution ends as follows. The provisions of this chapter shall have effect for the purpose of affording protection to those rights and freedoms subject to such limitations of that protection as are contained in those provisions, being limitations designed to ensure that the enjoyment of those rights and freedoms by any individual does not prejudice the rights and freedoms of others or the public interest. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier in my intervention, the purpose of this legislation is to protect our public and the Republic's interests by ensuring that at no moment any information, our sovereignty is deliberately negatively altered in the prescribed formats by the legislation. Mr. Speaker, sir, the exclusive economic zone spans over 2.3 million square kilometers. And I would like to refer to Honorable Lobin, who mentioned on a radio program that the legislation should specify that it will only be applicable from the UK's claim of the existence of the BIUT. Mr. Speaker, sir, this does not stand as an argument. Any legislation cannot be passed, and with a specific mention that is only applicable for the UK's claim on the BIUT. As a reminder, in addition to the main island, the Republic of Mauritius includes the island of Karajos, the Saint-Bruno group of 16 islands, which lie 402 kilometers north, Rodrigues Island, situated 560 kilometers, and the northeast, Agalega, located on 933 kilometers to the north, and Tromelin to the northwest. If we agree to this argument, it would mean having a legislation which does not allow misleading information on our sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago, but plainly accepting a misleading statement over our other islands such as Rodrigues and Agalega. Hence, anyone could print a map mentioning that Rodrigues is an American or British territory, and we would not be able to legally act upon it. The Constitution also defines clearly Republic of Mauritius, and I quote, "The island of Mauritius, Rodrigues, Galega, Tromne, Carajos, and the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego Garcia, and any other island comprised in the state of Mauritius." Hence, this legislation protects our whole EEZ with the exclusive economic zone and territorial sovereignty by not excluding any territory, unlike how some members would have done, which demonstrate their illogical approach. Mr. Speaker, sir, I would urge members not to indulge in a fear-mongering campaign within the population, as they so often have done with previous legislations. Hence, by virtue of Section 10 of the Constitution, every person charged with a criminal offense is recognized as the following rights, among others: right to be afforded a fair hearing within a reasonable time by an independent and impartial tribunal, right to be informed of the nature of the offense preferred against him, right to freedom, right to be presumed innocent, and right to be given adequate time and facilities for the preparation of his defense. Mr. Speaker, sir, the right to equality with the courts and to a fair trial is guaranteed by our Constitution. The judiciary is underpinned by the core values of independence, impartiality, and integrity, which are vital for the effectiveness of the right to a fair trial, even if an individual is arrested for an offense under the proposed legislation. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is a matter of great pride for our Republic that on 20th February 2020, the United Nations released its revised map, where it clearly states that the Chagos Archipelago is under the territorial sovereignty of the Republic of Mauritius. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is indeed a huge historical milestone. In fact, Mauritius was between 1638 and 1810 under both Dutch and French occupation, followed by British colonial rule between 1810 and 1968, where the country gained independence. Throughout 1683 to 1967, that is, for 329 years, the Chagos Archipelago had always been an integral part of Mauritius on any maps and was treated as such by successive administering powers. However, following annexation in 1967, and after 53 years of a long, arduous fight led by late Sanu Jagannath and now by Honorable Pravin Kumar Jagannath, the Chagos Archipelagos are now back on the United Nations map as a territory of Mauritius. Mr. Speaker, sir, history is a sole witness that when the Labour Party was in power, when the Chagos Archipelago were resisted from the newly formed Republic of Mauritius. However, we are proud that this side of the House, the MSM party, of course, is now gradually changing the course of history, mainly through the bold actions of late Sanu Jagannath, and now the Prime Minister, Pravin Kumar Jagannath, is in the struggle of the Chagos Archipelago to be returned to Mauritius. This legislation is a further consolidation of our claim, and that nobody can be allowed to misinform with regards to the supreme issue of our Republic's territorial sovereignty. As very famously said by Mark Twain, and I quote, "In the beginning of a change, the patriot is the scarce man, and brave and hated and scorned. When his cause succeeds, the timid join him, and for then it costs nothing to be a patriot." The Honorable Prime Minister, a patriot to the core, has demonstrated throughout the years his courage in taking the bold but necessary initiatives to protect the nation. He has been and is still being unjustly and illogically criticized by certain members who have never demonstrated a sense of purpose and audacity to do the right thing, however difficult it might be. Hence, I invite timorous members to join us as the cause has succeeded and it costs nothing to be a patriot. Monsieur le Président, la souveraineté d'une nation est difficilement éradicable. Elle existe tant qu'il existe des hommes et des femmes prêts à lutter pour la préserver. Si isolés soient-ils, nous ne sommes, à mon avis, pas isolés, mais je pense que sur ce sujet de loi, l'opposition doit faire cause commune. Et merci de le faire, d'entendre certains membres être positifs pour cette cause. L'effort est aussi à mener pour prévenir toute limitation interne de la souveraineté, toute soumission rampante, et on peut compter sur le Premier ministre à ce sujet. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we are resolute, however difficult it is and however long it takes, we will walk the long walk towards full sovereignty together with our population. With this, Mr. Speaker, sir, I will say long live to Mauritius, and I'm done, Mr. Speaker, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, sir, this bill reinforces the sovereignty of Mauritius over its territory, and I'm glad that this bill is supported by MPs from all parties on all sides of this House. The object of the bill, Mr. Speaker, sir, is to criminalize the production and distribution of objects, maps, coins, and documents which misrepresent the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory. Mauritius is defined in our Constitution to include the island of Mauritius, Rodrigues, Agaliga, Tromelin, Corgados Carajos, and the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego Garcia. I didn't know myself what was Corgados Carajos. In fact, this is what we call Saint-Brandon. So one would have expected, Mr. Speaker, sir, that when we're bringing a bill which will criminalize misrepresentation of any part of the territory of Mauritius, the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part, that this bill will have to cover misrepresentation of the sovereignty of Mauritius over the island of Mauritius, of Rodrigues, Agaliga, Saint-Brandon, Chagos Archipelago, and also Tromelin. I single out Tromelin because there is a dispute between Mauritius and France over the sovereignty of Tromelin. However, when we turn to the provisions of the bill, the proposed new section 76B, subsection 2 of the amendment to the Criminal Code defines foreign state as a state which has been subject to a determination by any international court or tribunal that it has no valid claim to sovereignty over any part of the territory of Mauritius. So this definition of foreign state is very limitatively defined as a state who has been the subject of an adverse decision by a court. And as at now, there's only one such state, which is Great Britain. This definition does not cover France. This definition does not cover any other state, including the United States of America, or all the states that vote against us, be it Australia, Israel, Hungary, and the lot who vote consistently against Mauritius. So the bill only will criminalize the production and distribution of stamps, maps, coins, and other documents which are funded by the UK. Now, I hope in his summing up, the Honourable Prime Minister will tell us why Tromelin has been left out of the bill, and also what the Honourable Prime Minister intends to do to assert Mauritius' sovereignty over Tromelin. Mr. Speaker, sir, on the 8th of November 1965, the British Indian Ocean Territory Order in Council was made. It detached the island of Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius and Aldabra, Farquhar, and Desroches from Seychelles. It created a new territory known as the British Indian Ocean Territory. The British have always claimed that in September 1965, during the Constitutional Conference at Lancaster House on the forthcoming independence of Mauritius, there was a meeting between representatives of the Mauritian government and the colonial secretary at which the detachment of the Mauritius Islands was discussed. The British had always claimed that the Mauritian ministers present in London agreed to the detachment of Chagos Island in return for up to £3 million in compensation. The agreement was formalized in February 1966. Between 1968 and 1971, the United Kingdom government secured the removal of the population of Diego Garcia, mostly to Mauritius and to the Seychelles. A small population remained on Peros Banos and the Solomon Island, but they were evacuated by the middle of 1973. The Chagosians were never consulted. They were uprooted and deported. And in the word of Lord Hoffman, the removal and resettlement of Chagosians was accomplished with a careless disregard of their interests. In fact, the UK government refused to acknowledge that there was any indigenous population for which the United Kingdom had a responsibility, although they knew full well, because there was a survey prepared by Mr. Robert Newton from the Colonial Office in 1964. So the British knew full well that in 1964, there was a total population of 1,364 Chagosians living principally on Diego Garcia, Peros Banos, and Solomon. The UK government lied about the existence of the Chagosian population. They lied because they were afraid of the Soviet Union and other non-aligned supporters who could use the presence of Chagosians to block the constitution of a military base on Diego Garcia. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, Article 73 of the United Nations Charter imposing an obligation on the member state who has assumed responsibilities for the administration of territories whose people have not yet attained a full measure of self-government, to promote the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories and act in their utmost interest. Therefore, if there were Chagosians, the British authorities had a responsibility under Article 73 of the United Nations Charter to look after the best interests of these people, and therefore they could not have uprooted them and handed over Diego Garcia to the American to build a military base. So the United Kingdom lied and pretended that there were no permanent inhabitants on Chagos Archipelago. To just give you an example of how the Chagosians were treated in those days by the colonial masters, allow me, Mr. Speaker, sir, to quote how the then permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign Office, Mr. Greenhill, in a correspondence referred to the natives of the Chagos Archipelago. He said, and I quote, "Unfortunately, along with the birds," referring to Chagos, "unfortunately, along with the birds, go some few Tarzan and Ben Fridays whose origins are obscure and who are being hopefully wished on to Mauritius." This is how our brothers and sisters from Chagos were treated by the colonial masters. And when the Chagosians arrived in Mauritius, they lived mostly in slums of Port Louis, in considerable poverty. Their conditions were miserable. As Honorable Paul Béranger stated, it was only in the mid-70s that the MMM brought the whole issue of sovereignty over Chagos on the agenda again. And we are very proud, Mr. Speaker, sir, we are very proud that in 1982, a daughter of Chagosian was elected under the banner of MMM-PSM Alliance, Honorable Ariane Navarre-Marie, who sits in this august assembly, remains the youngest ever MP to have been elected to this august assembly, and we're very proud to have her among our midst. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, Mauritius has continuously contested UK's sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago. We were coerced into giving up our islands. We acted under duress. It was the price to pay for our independence. The separation of the archipelago was in violation of several UN resolutions on decolonization, including Resolution 1514, passed on 14 December 1960, which banned the breaking up of colonies before independence. Our quest for the recognition of our sovereignty over the Chagos took a twist for the better when in December 2010, Mauritius initiated proceedings under the United Kingdom Article 287 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to challenge the legality of the marine protected area which the UK had purported to establish around Chagos Archipelago. The arbitral tribunal unanimously held that that marine protected area violated international law. But two judges, although minority in that arbitral tribunal award, also referred to the illegal excision of the Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius. And this led to the events that unfolded after that. The government took the bold decision to go along with the advice of Professor Philip Sands, QC, and requested an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences of the separation of Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius in 1965. In 2017, the United Nations General Assembly voted to refer the advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice. On 25 February 2019, the International Court of Justice issued its historical opinion by 13 judges to 14, telling us that Chagos Archipelago was and has always been an integral part of the territory of Mauritius. A few months later, in May 2019, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution to give effect to the advisory opinion and requested United Kingdom to withdraw its colonial administration within a period of 6 months, which ended on 22 November 2019. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, sir, the United Kingdom has shamelessly refused to implement the resolution of the United Nations. It is very important also, Mr. Speaker, sir, to note that the United Nations General Assembly called upon the United Nations and all its specialized agencies, as well as all other international, regional, and intergovernmental organizations to recognize that Chagos Archipelago forms an integral part of the territory of Mauritius. After that landmark decision, the United Nations published its new map number 4170. And for the first time under the island Chagos Archipelago, there was the word Maurice, short for Mauritius. Previously, instead of Mauritius, there was a note saying that, which read, Chagos appears without prejudice to the question of sovereignty. So that was a landmark decision that for the first time the United Nations in the world map recognized that Chagos Archipelago belonged to Mauritius. And this is why in the bill today before the House, it is being made a criminal offense for anyone to pretend otherwise, for any map of the world sponsored by the government of England to portray that Chagos is not the territory of Mauritius. Some more good news, Mr. Speaker, sir. On January earlier this year, the Special Chamber of International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea delivered its judgment on the preliminary objection raised by the Maldives on the case brought by Mauritius under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea for the delimitation of the maritime boundary between Mauritius and the Maldives. The Special Chamber ruled that the UK's continued claim to sovereignty over Chagos Archipelago was contrary to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice and against the United Nations Assembly resolution. In August 2021, the Universal Postal Union, adopted by a majority of 77 votes to 6, with 41 abstentions, that UPU will no longer register, distribute, or forward postage stamps issued by the so-called British Indian Ocean Territory. This decision is also very important for the purpose of this bill, because this bill is going to criminalize any person sponsored by the British government, including those who print stamps, in trying to assert that the Chagos Archipelago belongs to the British Indian Ocean Territory, because only Mauritius can print stamp to be used over Chagos Archipelago. Mr. Speaker, sir, I would like to here place on record our deepest appreciation and gratitude for the legal team who has been representing us before the various courts and tribunals, led by the able Professor Sand, but also our local lawyers, and in particular, Mr. Dhiren Debi, Senior Counsel, former Solicitor General, and his team, as well as our permanent representative to the United Nations, Mr. Jagdish Kunjal, who is in this house today, and his team for all the good work that they have been doing for the recognition of Mauritius, of sovereignty of Mauritius over Chagos Archipelago, and which they will continue to do until the Chagos are returned to Mauritius. Mr. Speaker, sir, the bill before this House makes it an offense, as I stated, to print, distribute, stamp coins which misrepresent the sovereignty of Mauritius. Now, any lawyer will tell you that it is extremely difficult to enforce a law with extraterritorial effect. You need to prove that it was the government of England who has given instruction to print the map, to mint the coin, to print the stamp. And the offense most probably is committed outside of Mauritius. So it's very difficult for Mauritius to enforce a law with extraterritorial effect. It's very difficult to convict and punish a criminal who has committed an offense outside of our borders. Yet, with this bill, we are sending a strong signal. We are sending a strong signal to the British government and all its contractors that we will spare no effort to enforce our sovereign rights over Chagos Archipelago. Mr. Speaker, sir, passing this bill is important, but not enough. We should continue our diplomatic effort for all states to recognize our sovereignty. Like Honorable Paul Béranger pointed out, the fact that there were 41 abstentions during the vote taken at the level of the Universal Postal Union, including some of our closest allies, some people with whom we have very ancestral relationship, like France, strong diplomatic relationships, show that we still need to convince our allies to enforce our legal rights over the Chagos Archipelago. And in this respect, Mr. Speaker, sir, as I have stated, the issue of sovereignty over Chagos is an issue which cut across party line. So when Sir Anirudh Jagannath, who I salute his contribution in getting Mauritius to where we are in terms of sovereignty over the Chagos, especially his very able submission before the International Court of Justice. When Sir Anirudh Jagannath was Prime Minister, he set up an all-parliamentary party committee which discussed strategy and action with regard to the sovereignty of Mauritius over Chagos Archipelago. I was privileged to be part of that committee together with Honorable Paul Béranger for the MMM. There were also representatives from all parties represented in Parliament in that committee. Unfortunately, we no longer have such a committee. And yet, Mr. Speaker, sir, the issue of sovereignty is a national issue above party politics. It is not too late. There are on both sides of the House people who master the subject, who have ideas, who can definitely assist government in asserting sovereignty over Chagos Archipelago and Tremblay. And I make an appeal to the Prime Minister to reconstitute this across-body, all-party parliamentary committee. Mr. Speaker, sir, I would end by paying tribute to all the Chagosians and well-wishers who have been struggling for the right to return to the Chagos Archipelago. They have gone on strike, They have been persecuted. They have challenged the mighty Great Britain before the English courts. Many have lost their lives along the way. I have in mind the likes of Mrs. Aurélie Talat, Mrs. Rita Bancoul, Mrs. Charlesia Alexis, Mrs. Ansi Jaffar, Rita Issou, Lisby Élysée, Mimose Fiercy, Tifrea Sormidaden, and Fernand Mandarin, to cite just a few. The struggle continues under the able leadership of Olivier Bancoul. Their fight for a return to Chagos Archipelago has been systematically frustrated by the British government and unfortunately by a majority of law lords in the House of Lords. Today, Mr. Speaker, sir, we take a pledge that it will be a Mauritius government who will allow them to visit their place of origin, the land of their ancestors, Chagos Archipelago, an integral part of the territory of the Republic of Mauritius. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. At the very outset, I welcome the amendments to the Criminal Code which have been brought to the House by the Honourable Prime Minister, which is yet another effort of this government to establish the sovereignty of the Republic of Mauritius. I share this opportunity to congratulate the Honourable Prime Minister for his relentless efforts to win this long-standing battle which Mauritius has engaged with a view to completing our decolonization process by restoring our sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago. And as history has shown, it was the war horse of late Sir Anirudh Jagannath. D'ailleurs, Monsieur le Président, feu Sir Anirudh Jagannath avait en 2018 choisi de se revêtir de sa toge d'avocat pour son plaidoyer en faveur de la souveraineté de Maurice sur les Chagos devant la Cour internationale de justice à La Haye. Mr. Speaker, sir, in his address before the International Court of Justice on the 3rd of September 2018 for an advisory opinion on the unlawful excision of Chagos Archipelago from the territory of Mauritius to create the so-called British Indian Ocean Territory, late Sir Anirudh Jagannath stated, and I quote, "Today, Mauritius is a peaceful and stable democratic state. It has maintained excellent relations with all states concerned with the questions referred to the court. However, I'm sorry to say that more than 50 years after independence and more than 50 years after I traveled to London for the Constitutional Conference, the process of decolonization of Mauritius remains incomplete as a result of the unlawful detachment of an integral part of our territory on the eve of our independence," unquote. These efforts have led to the advisory opinion on the 25th February 2019 by the ICJ, which found inter alia that the process of decolonization of Mauritius was not lawfully completed when the country acceded to its independence in 1968, when the Chagos Archipelago was detached from Mauritius, and where the ICJ concluded that the UK is under the obligation to bring to an end to its administration over the Chagos as rapidly as possible. This was followed by the United Nations General Assembly resolution on the 22nd of May 2019 to give effect to the advisory opinion of the ICJ. In its resolution, the UN General Assembly called upon all its member states and its specialized agencies to recognize that the Chagos Archipelago form an integral part of the territory of Mauritius. In this context, that the UPU adopted a resolution at its 27th Congress held in August this year on the implementation of the United Nations General Assembly resolution, which is yet another international support to the fight for the recognition of the Chagos Archipelago as a Mauritian territory. Mr. Speaker, sir, allow me to elaborate on the Universal Postal Union, UPU, which was established in 1874, that long ago. And UPU is the second oldest international organization worldwide after the ITU, which is the International Telecommunication Union. The UPU currently has 192 members. And after our independence, Mauritius became a member on the 29th of August, 1969. The organization fulfills an advisory, mediating and liaison role and provides technical assistance where needed. It sets the rules for international mail exchanges and makes recommendations to stimulate growth in mail, parcel, and financial service volumes and improve the quality of service of customers. As a United Nations specialized agency, the UPU is required to cooperate with and assist the UN and its principal and subsidiary organs, and therefore brought the matter to its primary governing body, that is the Congress, for a decision. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Chagos Archipelago was previously recognized as a part of the overseas territory of the United Kingdom. And let me highlight it again, that in May 2019, following the advisory opinion of the ICJ, the UN General Assembly instructed the UN and all the specialized agencies to recognize Mauritius' sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago and refrain from recognizing or implementing any measures taken by or on behalf of the so-called BIUT, British Indian Ocean Territory, BIUT. According to a UPU document of Council of Administration that was published in March 2021, there are two international mail processing centers, they call the IMPCs, that have been established on the Chagos Archipelago and the so-called British Indian Ocean Territory. One established by the designated operator of Australia, Australia Post, in 2001. The other one was established by the Royal Mail, the designator operator of the United Kingdom, in 2003. Moreover, in the past, UPU had registered and distributed postage stamps under the postal operator known as the so-called British Indian Ocean Territory. Mr. Speaker, sir, the resolution adopted by the UPU at its Congress, 27th Congress, held in August, provides for the following. A, the UPU formally acknowledge henceforth that for the purpose of its activities, so all activities relating to the post, the Chagos Archipelago forms an integral part of the territory of Mauritius. B, the International Bureau of the UPU should cease the registration, distribution, and forwarding of any and all postage stamps issued by the so-called BIUT. And C, no UPU documentation should include any reference to to the so-called BIOT or to the Chagos Archipelago as part of the member country of the UPU, known as the Overseas Territory of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, this decision was taken by member countries and passed with 77 votes in Abidjan in August. And as mentioned by many orators before me, only 6 votes that went against those resolutions. It is imperative to underline that the UPU has now stopped registration, distribution, and transmitting steps bearing the word BIOT. Following this resolution, Mauritius has now the duty to ensure the implementation. And therefore, as part of the resolution, to report to the UPU on the international postal operation in the Chagos Archipelago. What's happening there? Because they're not allowed anymore to use any stamps that is except those from Mauritius. An article published in the BBC website on the 25th of August of this year stated, and I quote, "The near unanimous votes by the UPU to make those stamps illegal worldwide is a blow to Britain, and another sign of its growing isolation over its claim to the Chagos Islands. All indications so far show that the Chagos issue, Britain has almost no allies left and is lone in this battle," unquote. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is very clear today that we have important international instances, as I mentioned earlier, ICJ, the United Nations, and through its specialized postal agency, the UPU, that have firmly stated their position to support Mauritius against the so-called British Indian Ocean territory. They no longer recognize the BIOT. The move by the UPU, the second oldest international organization, is in recognition of Mauritian sovereignty over the strategically important islands of the Indian Ocean. This is why the amendments brought to the Criminal Code before the House today by the Honorable Prime Minister, which will criminalize any action resulting to the production, distribution, supply, or marketing of any document or object, including a stamp, which gives a misrepresentation of the sovereignty of Mauritius, or therefore in line with the decision and action taken by these international instances. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, sir, this fight to restore our sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago was one which late Sir Nehru Jagannath had at heart. And it is our duty to honor his legacy. For the fight of all the Chagosians, for the fight of all the citizens of Mauritius, for the fight of the Republic of Mauritius, and for the fight of the sovereignty of our territory. And this reminds me the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, and I quote, "To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity," unquote. Mr. Speaker, sir, this government, under the very able leadership of the Prime Minister, will never give up. Never give up this fight for the sovereignty of our territory and for the justice to be given to the Sagosian, our people. And we all here in this house, we tell the Honorable Prime Minister, you will never walk alone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, the PMSD will vote for this bill. I have listened very passionately to the speech of Honorable Béranger, former Prime Minister. Thank you for sharing your vast experience and knowledge to this House on this very important issue which concerns all Mauritians. And also, I've listened to the elegant speech of the Honorable Prime Minister on this bill, and I must say that we are all united in this August Assembly to support all efforts being put in by the government, by the Honorable Prime Minister, to vindicate our sovereignty on the Chagos Archipelago. As it has been the case in the past, Mr. Speaker, sir, when the people of this country has been united in supporting the efforts of previous governments, former Prime Minister Honorable Béranger, former Prime Minister Dr. Navin Chandra Ramgoolam, former Prime Minister late Sir Anirudh Jagnat, in their quest to go the extra miles, to take legal actions before international forums against the UK. And at this stage, it must be pointed out that the game changer, in my humble opinion, Mr. Speaker, sir, is the legal struggle. That was the initiative of former Prime Minister Navin Chandra Ramgoolam to challenge the setting up of a marine park by the British government by taking the issue to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea as established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. This victory, Mr. Speaker, sir, gave hope that the larger battle could be won, as a window of opportunity had been opened for the Mauritian state to explore to the full all legal avenues for completing the decolonization process. Thereafter, Mr. Speaker, sir, successive governments continued the fight, and the unflinching determination and the moves that were made by former Prime Minister late Sir Anirudh Jagnat and the current Honorable Prime Minister to obtain a UN resolution which was successful and has led to the International Court of Justice giving an advisory opinion in favor of Mauritius. And Mr. Speaker, sir, the results are now indicative as to what we can achieve as a nation when we all join hands together to defend our motherland and stand and support our Chagosians, brothers and sisters. The backdrop to this bill, Mr. Speaker, sir, are the various legal battles that we as a nation have won against the UK. For instance, it is also worth pointing out that in 2019, an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice, endorsed by the UN General Assembly, found the UK in breach of international law by seeking to maintain its claim to the archipelago of Chagos. The UK ignored the ICJ and the UN opinions, dismissing them as purely advisory, which prompted our country to go to the International Maritime Court to press its claim. We did so by asking the Maritime Court, Mr. Speaker, sir, to resolve its separate maritime dispute with the Maldives, the other nearest island to the waters around our Chagos archipelago. The Maldives, Mr. Speaker, sir, most probably under the influence of the United Kingdom, had tried to fend off the involvement of the Maritime Court by saying there was an existing sovereignty dispute between the UK and Mauritius over the Chagos Islands, which meant it didn't need to negotiate with Mauritius. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, by 8 votes to 1, the Maritime Court, in a 1-hour judgment, ruled in favor of Mauritius, rejecting all the jurisdictional objections the Maldives had raised. The UK has been urged, Mr. Speaker, sir, to end its unlawful occupation of the Chagos Islands after Britain's claim to sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago was comprehensively rejected by the United Nations Special International Maritime Court in Hamburg. The rejection of the UK claim, Mr. Speaker, sir, was made by the Special Chamber of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which ruled that Mauritius was right to claim the Chagos Islands in line with previous international court rulings. The judgment also determined that the Maldives could not avoid negotiating its maritime boundaries with Mauritius by saying there was a valid live dispute over the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands between UK and Mauritius. And Mr. Speaker, sir, if the UK persists in its current position, it will be knowingly in breach of international law and its reputation damaged. The more so, Mr. Speaker, sir, the UK being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the UK should first and foremost have set the good example of following international law. The best thing it could do was to facilitate negotiations between Mauritius and the United States of America over the future of the US base on Diego Garcia. And I take it that the Honourable Prime Minister, during his meeting at the COP26 conference in Glasgow with the Prime Minister of the UK, has made this point very clear. And Mr. Speaker, sir, the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea would now delimit the maritime boundary between Mauritius and Maldives on the basis that the Chagos archipelago was Mauritius territory. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, this revised and third version of the two previous criminal code amendment bills now brings clarity and certainty as to our continued effort to explicitly cement our sovereignty on Chagos archipelago. Mr. Speaker, sir, this bill, through the introduction of a new Section 76B to our criminal code, as per clause 3 of this bill, will make it a criminal offense to produce or circulate materials that would question the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory. And I am of the humble view that this version of the bill, which has changed dramatically since the first version appeared way back in 2020, as couched now, makes it clearer about producing, supplying or marketing any coin, stamp, official map or technical report or other similar object that question the sovereignty of Mauritius over any part of its territory. Mr. Speaker, sir, this bill also departs completely from what were contained in the two previous bills that were later withdrawn. And the Honourable Prime Minister has indeed last Tuesday rightly made the following statement in this August Assembly that, and I quote, "The aspects of the bill that did not involve any act on the part of the foreign state and that could potentially adversely impact on arguably genuine exercise of freedom of expression are being no longer proceeded with. Instead, I unquote, instead of prosecuting individuals and persons acting on their own, this bill, Mr. Speaker, sir, limits prosecutions to people's materials contesting the Mauritian sovereignty over any part of its territory just to those acting on behalf of a foreign state. And in this bill, Mr. Speaker, sir, at clause 3, introducing the new section 76B at its subsection 2, provides the definition of foreign state as follows, and I quote, "Foreign state means a state which has been subject to a determination by any international court or tribunal that it has no valid claim to sovereignty over any part of the territory of Mauritius," unquote. I would have gone a step further, Mr. Speaker, sir, by clearly inserting the United Kingdom as being the foreign state we are referring to. Inasmuch as far as I recollect, the UK is the only country that has so far suffered legal reversals of such a nature as described in the proposed clause 3, falling within the definition thereof. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, I am also of the view that this bill will be limited in its applicability, though. How would you go about and prosecute if the offense is being committed outside Mauritius? If, say, it is committed in the UK, would our country get mutual legal assistance from them to bring anyone that has offended under this law? Be as it may, though, Mr. Speaker, sir, this piece of legislation, this third and revised version of the Criminal Code Amendment Bill, is commendable, having taken into account suggestions and criticisms made with regard to the two previous versions of the bill, and we shall all, as parliamentarians and as a nation, stand united to always enhance and exercise our sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago. I shall thus, also on behalf of the PMSD, Mr. Speaker, sir, and from this side of the House, reiterate our support to vote for this bill and stand united with our Chagosian brothers and sisters in their continued fights to resettle on the Chagos Islands and to stand by our country to exercise our sovereignty on the Chagos Archipelago. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. God bless our country.
Monsieur le Président, le projet de loi qui a été circulé dans cette auguste assemblée marque un moment historique de l'histoire de la souveraineté et territorialité de notre République. L'île Maurice, la République de Maurice, est une jeune nation de 50 ans. Une nation qui a subi, sans contestation, avec le support justement des Nations Unies, une violation à son droit à l'autodétermination. Il est un fait que notre République a été, comme on dit en anglais, coerced, et a donné une partie de son territoire en échange de son indépendance. Ce fait n'est plus à être établi. La Cour internationale de justice et la résolution qui a suivi des Nations Unies juste après, le 22 mai 2019, a établi les faits. L'île Maurice compte parmi son territoire les îles des Chagos, l'archipel des Chagos. En tant que jeune nation, il était essentiel que notre Parlement, à l'unanimité, supporte ce projet de loi. Donc, il faut féliciter toutes les parties présentes de leur soutien et de leur patriotisme face aux géants contre qui nous devons lutter. Monsieur le Président, ce projet de loi parle de timbres, de coins, de documents officiels, mais ne sous-estimons pas l'importance de ces objets quand on parle de souveraineté et territorialité d'un pays. Ce sont les premiers objets qui reflètent la souveraineté d'un pays. Un pays, quand il veut affirmer son appartenance, la première chose qu'il fait, il fait des timbres, il fait de la monnaie, il imprime des documents officiels. Toutes les correspondances doivent marquer le territoire qui fait partie dont fait partie sa nation. L'île Maurice, une jeune nation qui a eu le support des pays non alignés et les pays de l'Union africaine. Fait historique, monsieur, puisque depuis que les Nations Unies ont eu comme responsabilité d'assurer la décolonisation du monde, une injustice a été faite, mais à ce moment précis, les États qui ont été décolonisés n'avaient pas le pouvoir politique ou militaire de s'imposer à ce moment précis. Rappelons-nous du contexte dans lequel la décolonisation de notre pays et le démembrement des archipels de Chagos ont été faits. C'était au lendemain de la guerre froide, monsieur. À un moment où il y avait deux blocs politiques qui se battaient pour de l'influence. L'OTAN avait vu naissance. L'OTAN a été mis sur pied pour que les pays de l'Europe occidentale, avec le soutien des États-Unis, s'assurent que l'Union soviétique respecte les accords de paix, mais aussi qu'elle ne succombe pas à la tentation d'aller envahir les pays européens occidentaux. L'article 1 de la Charte des Nations Unies, qui donne le droit à l'autodétermination, ce qu'on appelle le self-determination, aux États, a été fait avec à l'esprit les pays de l'Union européenne qui ont souffert de l'invasion de l'Union soviétique. Historique, monsieur, que 50 ans après, ce soit l'île Maurice, un pays qui fait partie du bloc des non-alignés, qui outtorque la Grande-Bretagne quant à l'article 1 de la Charte des Nations Unies. Ce qui est déconcertant, monsieur, c'est que la première conférence pour la paix entre les nations date de 1819. Il y a eu des évolutions. 100 ans après 1919, ils commencent à trouver un accord qui n'a pas pu empêcher la Seconde Guerre mondiale, monsieur. Après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, le monde se dit « ça suffit ». 51 pays disent « ça suffit, plus de guerre, nous allons vers une culture institutionnaliste où tous les conflits seront résolus par des institutions, par le dialogue, où nous respecterons ce qu'on appelle l'état de droit, the rule of law, où les États acceptent de se plier à ce qu'on appelle le rule of law, Monsieur le Président. Cette institution devient les Nations Unies. Elle a pour une des premières tâches la décolonisation. Maurice se sent lésé. Et cette même institution qui a permis le démembrement des Chagos à l'île Maurice affirme maintenant que nous avons toute la souveraineté sur ces îles. Et nous faisons face, monsieur, à une situation sans précédent. La situation est que les Nations Unies ont passé une résolution où tous ces organismes, y compris l'Union postale des Nations Unies, décident d'implémenter ce jugement de territorialité. Et nous voici dans une situation où les États-Unis et l'Angleterre, dans un climat géopolitique changeant, décident de ne plus se plier aux accords multilatéraux dont ils ont eux-mêmes été fondateurs. Que faire dans cette situation? L'île Maurice a pris la décision de l'institutionnalisme. Elle décide de continuer sa voie, qui est d'utiliser les Nations Unies et toutes les institutions qui ont été mises sur pied 50 ans de cela pour s'assurer que nos pays vivent en paix et que chaque partie du monde ait droit au rule of law. À chaque fois, monsieur, qu'un État qui est jugé faible, qui est un État qui n'a pas le dessus, fait appel aux Nations Unies, elle renforce cette institution. Ne sous-estimons pas l'apport de cette loi et l'apport de ce combat au niveau international. Par cette loi et ce combat, nous faisons que renforcer ces institutions qui sont les Nations Unies et la Cour internationale de justice. Nous mettons les pays membres fondateurs devant un fait accompli. Il est vrai, nous ne pourrons pas aller en guerre. Nous n'avons pas d'armée. Il est vrai que nous n'avons pas le temps pour nous forcer les autres États à se plier aux décisions de la Cour internationale de justice. Mais sommes-nous à cette époque, monsieur? Rappelons-nous que l'OTAN a été formé en 1949. De 1949 à 2021, n'avons-nous pas développé une culture institutionnelle suffisante pour que des États membres, qu'ils soient petits ou grands, puissent résoudre les conflits par la Cour internationale de justice? Nous ne sommes pas à une époque où une simple résolution des Nations Unies, qui passe à majorité 115 États, ne sommes-nous pas à une époque où c'est suffisant pour que l'île Maurice ne se laisse pas faire et ne baisse pas les bras? Parce que nous devenons un symbole pour l'Afrique, Nous devenons un symbole pour le mouvement non aligné, Monsieur le Président. Personnellement, j'apprécie que toutes les parties présentes dans cette auguste assemblée se rallient derrière notre Premier ministre, sans considération partisane, parce qu'il s'agit avant tout de l'histoire de notre nation, qui a 50 ans, et qui, après 50 ans, décide de l'affirmer et réclame son droit à l'autodétermination. C'est-à-dire, elle veut pouvoir faire usage de son territoire comme bon lui semble. Monsieur, mais cependant, il y a eu quelques arguments qui, pas pour des raisons politiques, qu'il faut quand même réfuter. Par exemple, l'honorable Paul Béranger, j'imagine que ce n'est pas exprès, qu'il a dû mal lire les documents. Paul de la BIOT, qui a voté lors du vote de l'Union postale des Nations Unies. Mais ce n'est pas vrai, monsieur. C'est le Overseas Territory, c'est-à-dire la Grande-Bretagne et le Northern Ireland qui a voté. Parce que la BIOT a été bannie depuis la résolution du 22 mai 2019. Si vous ne voulez pas me croire, monsieur, il ne faut que consulter le document de vote qui est devant moi. Et c'est un fait, c'est un fait. Il fallait rectifier cela, parce que c'est misleading. Parce que cela aurait impliqué qu'une agence des Nations Unies ne respecte pas la résolution de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies, qui est institutionnellement pas possible, monsieur. La deuxième chose, c'est cette comparaison persistante avec les Tromelins. Je pense qu'il faut clarifier certaines choses, parce que c'est une comparaison qui peut amener des confusions conceptuelles. La souveraineté des Tromelins a été réclamée par la France en 1716. Le cas de l'archipel des Chagos s'est produit après que les Nations Unies soient mises sur pied et qu'il y ait eu une résolution, justement, de par le monde pour la décolonisation. Et les documents officiels du gouvernement anglais démontrent que tout a été fait pour masquer la vérité au niveau des Nations Unies et faire croire qu'il n'y avait pas de population indigène. C'est deux cas différents, monsieur. Deux cas différents. Puisque le deuxième cas est une violation directe à cet article 1. C'est une tentative malicieuse qui a été documentée de démembrer le territoire mauricien des archipels des Chagos, alors que Tromelin, c'est une dispute qui date de 1716. Donc, institutionnellement, si on remet dans le contexte des lois, des conventions et des articles, même de la Charte des Nations Unies, ce n'est pas deux cas qui sont directement comparables. Comme le dit Osman Mohamed, it's not apple with apple. Donc j'ai pensé qu'il fallait rétablir certains faits, non pas pour contredire qui que ce soit, puisque les débats étaient intéressants et que cette Chambre a fait preuve de patriotisme jusqu'à l'heure. Donc, à aucun moment, que ce soit les membres du gouvernement, n'a l'intention de se disputer contre une opposition qui agit de façon patriote et qui se rallie derrière notre Premier ministre dans ce combat qui ne sera pas des moindres. Le timing, monsieur, je diffère sur cette question. La question de est-ce que c'est le bon timing. Monsieur, c'est le meilleur timing qu'on puisse avoir. Parce que depuis la guerre froide, depuis le démembrement des archipels des Chagos de Maurice, il y a eu le Brexit, où, historiquement, monsieur, c'est la première fois qu'un juge...
Vous voulez dire monsieur le président?
Excusez-moi. Je bug toujours. Je m'excuse. Mais vous savez que je parle de vous. C'est ça qui compte. Donc, mais je m'excuse. Donc, pour revenir, oui, historiquement, monsieur le président, c'est la première fois que la Grande-Bretagne, suivant le Brexit, n'est pas représenté sur la Cour internationale de justice. Monsieur le Président, les États-Unis, sous l'administration de Donald Trump, ont tendu leurs relations avec l'OTAN. Ces deux pays ont, en quelque sorte, tourné le dos aux accords aux accords entre plusieurs pays. Donc, c'est historique pour nous, monsieur, parce que le mouvement non aligné qui se trouve principalement, les forces dont les leaders se trouvent principalement de notre côté du monde, l'océan Indien, sont en montée en puissance. Et nous parlons des pays comme l'Inde. Historique pour nous, monsieur, parce que la question, monsieur le Président, parce que la question de notre positionnement géopolitique est plus que jamais pertinente. L'action de notre Premier ministre aujourd'hui détermine notre positionnement. L'action de notre Premier ministre pour la nation mauricienne aujourd'hui détermine notre positionnement géopolitique à long terme. N'ignorons pas ce qui se passe autour de nous quand il s'agit de World Order. Les choses changent et nous nous positionnons avec ce courage, cette détermination, comme une nation qui, après 50 ans d'indépendance, réclame son droit à l'autodétermination, mais qui se renforce dans sa position de pays non aligné de ce mouvement. Nous nous positionnons comme un petit pays qui a un réseau suffisamment grand, qui est l'Afrique, et les pays non alignés qui ont voté unanimement en notre faveur. Nous nous positionnons comme un pays qui a de l'influence au niveau international. Et aussi, nous nous positionnons comme un pays qui a fait que les pays européens se sont abstenus, pour beaucoup, de voter contre nous. Et ce principe d'autodétermination. Nous nous positionnons comme un pays où des pays du Commonwealth, monsieur, ont voté, se sont abstenus et n'ont pas pris parti avec l'Angleterre. Nous nous positionnons historiquement comme ce pays. L'histoire connaît l'île Maurice et son territoire pour son importance géographique et géopolitique. Dorénavant, on parlera de l'île Maurice comme symbole de l'autodétermination. Et le pays qui a osé, petit oui, mais qui a osé rallier, rassembler derrière lui tous les pays non alignés et l'Union africaine pour qu'on soit respecté 50 ans après la décolonisation des différents territoires à travers le monde. La démocratie, monsieur, est un process ongoing et nous participons à la consolidation des Nations Unies et la Cour internationale de justice. Nous ne savons pas de quoi sera fait demain. Mais la question que je veux poser, c'est est-ce que nous pensons sincèrement que les deux BSO de la démocratie continueront de façon persistante à ne pas suivre le rule of law? Qui nous a appris le rule of law, Monsieur le Président? C'est l'Angleterre. C'est un principe anglais. C'est l'Angleterre qui a inspiré Montesquieu, qui ensuite est allé inspirer les États-Unis et la Révolution française. Donc, est-ce que cette situation va perdurer? Je ne pense pas, Monsieur le Président, parce que cela voudra dire que les pays occidentaux ne sont plus fidèles à leurs principes. Et le premier principe est le rule of law. C'est pour cela que je félicite notre Premier ministre d'avoir été un digne représentant de la nation mauricienne. Et nous comptons sur cette détermination pour continuer à donner forme à ces institutions internationales, puisque le mouvement des pays non alignés, que tous les pays qui ont été colonisés sont en train de s'imposer à travers le monde. Le world order est en train de changer et notre positionnement devient de plus en plus pertinent. Donc, félicitations à la nation mauricienne pour ce combat, félicitations à ce Parlement de voter unanimement pour une loi qui va nous projeter vers l'avenir. Merci, je termine, monsieur.
Members will suspend the sitting for 1 hour and a half.